Good evening, everybody. Lovely to have you here, and thanks so much for joining us for this final installment of our leadership series for 2024. As I said before, we're so grateful that you've decided to take time out of, I'm sure, a busy holiday schedule to share your time with us. So thank you for that. My name is Brian Boyle. I serve as the Chief Program Officer and General Counsel here at American Promise. And before we turn to tonight's conversation, I wanted to just give a few brief updates to all of you as we head into 2025. So you may have heard, but we just emerged from another election cycle in which billions of dollars were spent to influence elections throughout the country. And according to the latest projections, we're still getting finalized results from the states and federal election commissions, but the projections are that over $20 billion will have been spent in state and federal elections in this cycle. Now, I think as some of you may know, a week before the election, we actually released our latest public opinion poll. I think we'll be able to make that available in the chat. And in that poll, we saw that 82% of voters view the influence of money in politics as a threat to self-government. And 77% of Americans support our constitutional amendment, which would allow the states and Congress to decide whether and how to regulate money in elections. And importantly, we saw that those views are shared by Americans in supermajority levels across the political spectrum. So it doesn't matter which party, there's a really strong sentiment across the board. We see a clear and continuing desire for constitution-level change when it comes to the influence of money in politics, which is why, as we close out 2024, we are getting ready to hit the ground running in 2025. So just a few quick highlights. We're currently in the process of sharing information and materials with the newly elected members of Congress because we want to introduce them to American Promise and the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment. We also are planning in 2025 to drastically increase the number of meetings that we're able to have with members of Congress and their staff, both in DC and in district. And I know a lot of the volunteers on tonight's call are looking forward to participating in that. And we thank you, of course, for your support. We're also poised to run campaigns, legislative resolution campaigns in 11 states next year. And as many of you know, those resolutions call on Congress to propose an amendment to address money in politics. And those resolutions and our state efforts are a crucial part of our strategy to get states ready to ratify the amendment once it is formally proposed by Congress. And then also, we're really excited about growing our visibility and upping our game with a more sophisticated communication strategy in the new year. We know from all the polling that Americans really have an appetite for our solution, but honestly, more of them need to know about us and the work and how to get involved. So there's a lot going on as we head into the new year. I'd like to just also shout out to the entire team at American Promise and all of our volunteers who've just been doing tremendous work. There's a lot of energy. And in fact, just before Thanksgiving, we had an in-person retreat with our full staff. And I think it is fair to say that the team is fired up. So we are excited. And speaking of being fired up, I think many on tonight's call are very excited to hear from our guest this evening, Dr. Yuval Levin. Dr. Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and that's where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He is the founder and editor of National Affairs, a very prominent journal, and he's also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. We are so grateful, Dr. Levin, to you for joining tonight's call. And I know that everyone who's tuning in tonight is excited to hear about your latest book, which is a fantastic read. Highly recommend if you haven't ordered it, be a great holiday present for your loved ones. But before we delve into that, I actually was hoping we could learn a little bit about your background. So would you mind just kind of sharing a few words about your early life and upbringing?
Sure thing, Brian. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all the work that American Promise does. My story. So I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. My family came to America when I was 8 years old, and I became an American citizen at the age of 19. So I mostly grew up here, grew up in New Jersey, and took an early interest in politics from a young age. And somehow or other, it's always a mystery how people get interested in what they get interested in. But I became an American history and politics buff and found my way to Washington for college, and that's more or less how I my story began.
Thank you so much. And actually, there was one little housekeeping item that I forgot to mention, which is that we will be taking questions toward the end. And if you have a question, I would just invite you to please use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So thanks in advance for submitting any questions that way. So, it's evident from your work and your career that you're somebody who really believes in the power of ideas. And I'm just wondering, do you, like, looking back on your intellectual development, do you remember when that took hold? And were there certain ideas that you encountered early on that ended up kind of shaping your career trajectory?
As I say, I came to the U.S. as a child, and I would say I was always, from as far back as I can remember, just immensely impressed with the sheer diversity and energy of this country, and took an interest in what it was that made things work here. And from the beginning, for me, an interest in politics was an interest in something like the intersection of political ideas and public policy. And so how it is that our priorities and what we care about and believe in life relates to the way in which government ends up working and elections and politics ends up working. And so my work has always been near that intersection, sometimes on one side of it and sometimes on the other. I've spent a lot of time working in government. I was a congressional staffer for a long time and was a White House staffer. And I've spent a lot of time working in the think tank world, which is kind of a bridge between academic work and public policy. I got a PhD at the University of Chicago, which was focused in political theory, not in public policy, after having, as an undergraduate, really focused on policy. And so for me, the meeting place of those has really always been what's interesting about politics. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a way to understand what lies beneath the more obvious and unavoidable elements of our political life. So I've now spent the last 15 years almost looking into the ways in which our society has become divided and our ability to act together is broken down. And seeing those problems from that intersection of political theory and public policy, I think, is a useful way to shed light on things that might not otherwise be obvious. If you start from the problems everybody sees, polarization and the breakdown of our political culture, but try to understand them in terms that come from political theory and sociology and questions of how communities hold together, how people find meaning, I think you can arrive at some ways of understanding the problems we have that are not always present and available to people in our political life. And so that's been really the nature of my work. It's what interests me about politics. It's not just about ideology and winning and losing, but really about how people's understanding of who we are as human beings, the priorities they form in the communities they come from, really end up shaping our public life together.
Mm. When you were saying that you moved to the United States as a relatively young child and quickly grew to appreciate the system we have here, when I was reading American Covenant, it sort of comes across a little bit as a love letter to the best things about our founding era. And
Yeah.
I think a key insight that pervades the book is around these concepts of unity and social cohesion. And so if I could, for those that haven't read it, I wanted to share a quote. You write, "In the political life of a free society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together." And so I was wondering, was that theme of unity in your mind before you started the book, or did it emerge like through the process of writing it? And could you also just flesh out a little bit more some examples of how the Constitution I mean, I love this, promotes acting together without requiring that we have to all think alike.
Yeah, thank you for putting your finger on that. That is really the core idea of the book. That at the center of our constitutional system is a conception of unity that is never fully articulated, not by the framers and not by scholars of the Constitution, but that is embodied by the system. The idea that a free society is never going to be unanimous about anything. And really, anybody who's been in any community of people who are free to express their views knows that you're never going to have full agreement on things that matter. And yet, that society can be unified because unity in political life means finding ways to act together to address common problems rather than finding ways to stop disagreeing. And the insight that the framers bring, and to me, this is especially James Madison's view. You know, my take on the Constitution, I'm not a lawyer. I'm more like a recovering political scientist. And I'm most drawn to James Madison, who's the non-lawyer among the prominent framers of the Constitution. Madison was a political person. The only jobs he ever had were political, elected office and appointed office. And he thought about politics as a way to allow us precisely to address common problems, given the fact, the undeniable fact, that there will always be diversity of views in a free society. And so the challenge that he confronted, what really stands out about Madison, you know, you find in that founding generation people who are recognizably kind of precursors of what we think of as left and right. Somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who cares about dynamism and the capacity of our society to achieve social order. Someone like Thomas Jefferson, who cares about equality and the capacity of our society to achieve something like social justice. James Madison very distinctly worries about cohesion and the capacity of our society to achieve some unity given its diversity. He worries about faction. He worries about the breakdown of social order. And his approach to dealing with it, which is ultimately the Constitution's approach, is to bring competing groups in our society into direct negotiation and engagement with each other. And the insight that he brings to our moment, when you really look at this time through Madison, what you come to see is that we have not forgotten how to agree with each other in American life. What we've forgotten is how to disagree.
Mhm.
We spend all of our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. We spend very little time now engaged in disagreement, in constructive disagreement that points somewhere, that says, this is my view, your view is different. What can we do so that what matters most to me can be achieved and what matters most to you can be achieved? How can we find ways to engage with each other? The constitutional system itself is built to constantly compel us to do this through various forms of structured processes of negotiation. The logic of federalism works like this. The centrality of Congress is all about this. The separation of powers, the ways in which our system compels accommodation and negotiation is rooted in this sense. And the ways in which the system is broken down over and over look like the breakdown of these processes of structured negotiation. And so what is now failing to work is exactly that idea of how we can act together even when we don't think alike. That's really a central goal of the system, the way in which it tries to address our divisions. And I think it's also why constitutional restoration and renewal is the way forward now, because we are in a moment when that is the set of skills we lack. Coalition building, negotiating, and bargaining is what we've forgotten how to do in American life. And one way to recall and remind ourselves about it is to reacquaint ourselves with the Constitution.
Yeah, no, well, at American Promise, we completely agree that the Constitution, if you really decide to engage and take on what we call Constitution level politics, it forces you to be willing to act together, even if you don't think alike on everything. You mentioned federalism in your remarks a moment ago, and one of the things that jumped out at me is you have a whole chapter, and here at AP, we love federalism. We think it's a key structural device that the founders really thought this is going to be one of the key ways for people in different parts of the country to kind of truly be able to self-govern without a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's actually why in the text of our proposed amendment, we identify federalism as what we call a compelling sovereign interest that belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to any particular government. It's ours. So could you just say a little bit more about your conception of what federalism is and why a healthy commitment to that federalism can allow us to be more unified while also being more diverse?
Yeah, federalism is really essential for just that purpose. It's a way to allow us to answer some questions in different ways at the same time in different places, so that not everything has to be resolved in a unitary way, and not every disagreement has to rise to the level of an absolute national contested question. I think it's very important to leave room for that so that we can try different governing approaches. The fact is, we don't have all the answers to how we ought to govern ourselves. When you don't have the answers, the best thing to do is to experiment with different approaches and see what can work. I think it's important to start with the question in the way in which you put it, which is just what is federalism? Federalism is actually a very strange thing, and it was the result itself of a set of compromises at the Constitutional Convention. There was a major dispute at the convention, really the major dispute, had to do with the roles of the states in relation to the national government. And there were two camps at the convention. Some people thought that what they were doing was creating a national state, which might have these 13 administrative districts that had been the states before, but would essentially be governed nationally. And the national government would govern the people directly. Others argued that what they were doing was creating a confederation, something like the United Nations, where problems that were problems between the states and joint problems of the states could be addressed by agreement among the states, but that only the states would govern the people directly, and the national government would essentially coordinate to address problems that the states confronted. This disagreement could not be resolved, and ultimately the convention came to a novel idea, which had not really existed before, which was this kind of system of federalism, what James Madison called a compound republic, where both the national government and the state governments govern the people directly, but they do that with respect to different areas of policy. The national government governs in relation to foreign policy and defense policy and economic policy. Now, that's a short list, it's just three, but economic policy is a lot of what government does. And so that's a very, very important domain to leave to the national government. And essentially everything else was left to the states. The core police powers, that is most of what government does, were left to the states. That arrangement had to be rebalanced in light of the need to end slavery in the 19th century. The slavery debate, which of course tore up the country and led to the Civil War, resulted in a rebalancing of federalism. The 14th Amendment, and in some ways the 13th and the 15th too, fundamentally involved a rebalancing of federalism. They describe a new power of the federal government, which is to ensure the equal protection of the laws to all people, regardless of their race. And that is an essential power of the federal government. It was the right decision in the wake of the Civil War. But otherwise, the arrangement of federalism was left as this peculiar compound republic. There are some things our national government does, and it does those directly. It governs us. And there are a lot of things the state governments do, and those also govern us directly as citizens. What that allows for is a genuine diversity of modes of governance. And what was especially important to the framers was that this was not a layered system of government where the national government is at the top and then the states are at the bottom, but rather this is a parallel system of government. The powers of the states and the national government are separated from each other. And we've entangled them some. In the 20th and 21st centuries, we've created some domains like education and welfare and healthcare where federal and state power are very much entangled with each other. And what you find in a lot of these areas is a lack of responsibility. It's not clear who's in charge. It's not clear how decisions are supposed to be made. What happens in a lot of these domains is the federal government provides money and the states provide administrative capacity. And the states end up functioning as administrative districts of national programs. this generally doesn't work well. And I think an agenda of federalism reform would have to involve some disentangling. Maybe we need to decide that some new areas belong to the national government, but if they do, they should belong only to the national government. And the entanglement of the states and the federal government creates irresponsibility at both levels. Everybody blames the other for things that go wrong. Nobody has real accountability. And that becomes a real problem in a lot of domains. And so I think there is room to revitalize federalism. And we have to do that by seeing that one of the things it really does for us is lower the temperature of our national politics
Yeah.
by removing some important debates from the national level. And you can say, look, I live in Mississippi and you live in California. We're going to have different education systems. We just have different priorities. We're going to think differently about welfare, and that's okay. We can live with that. There's some things that have to be resolved nationally, but most things don't, and that means that our national elections don't have to be about everything, and therefore they don't have to be as divisive as they've become.
No, that's terrific. And if I could, just there was a reflection that you included in the chapter on federalism, where you make an observation about the nationalization of our politics. And you suggest that a hyper-nationalized politics, I'm going to quote, you say it tends to emphasize symbolic debates over practical governance, and that can lead us to think of people with different views from ours as the problem to be solved. And we had a question in the chat, which is pointing to some of this polarization about how the two major political parties sort of seem to be pulled apart in separate directions. And if I could, I wanted to just connect this a little bit to our work that we're doing here at American Promise, because as you might know, studies have shown that a relatively small number of zip codes they are responsible for the vast majority of money that flows through our campaign and election system. So we believe that the current status quo of the way that money is flowing and the volume of it can undermine federalism, because what it means is you're getting a few zip codes sort of spreading their hyper-nationalized messages throughout the country. And I'm wondering, do you think that the way money flows through our system could be contributing to an unhealthy hyper-nationalization of politics?
Yeah, there's a lot there to think about. I would say a few things. First of all, nationalization is an important way to think about this problem, where we come to understand everything about our politics as essentially one big question, this side or that side. And a lot of what politicians end up doing are kind of symbolic modes of expressive politics that are basically ways of saying, I'm on team A or I'm on team B, rather than having to do with the nature of the problems we face. And in a lot of places, local politics, certainly state politics, have been nationalized in this way. So that where I live in Maryland, we had a county commission race in this last election that was all about immigration. And I think immigration is really important, but the county commission doesn't have anything to do with immigration. It was really just a way of saying, I'm on the right or I'm on the left, and nothing about what they would actually do. I think the one remaining exception in a lot of our in a lot of state politics now is the governor's office. People still have a sense that governors have practical work to do, that they're in charge when things go wrong, that they should be judged by how they do, and governorships are the least polarized of our elective offices at any level. You can find a lot of people voting for a president of one party and a governor of the other party at the same time. There's very little of that kind of ticket splitting in any other way now. The senators tend to be thought of as national figures, and there's generally not a lot of splitting now between Senate and presidential races. But governors are still different. We had a Republican governor in Maryland for 8 years, while Democrats won the state in the presidential races by 30 points. You see the same thing in Massachusetts, or North Carolina has a Democratic governor now. That suggests that people think about that office in a distinct way that has to do with practical needs. And I do think that part of the way in which politics has been nationalized is that various attempts to democratize our party system have had counterintuitive effects and unintended effects. The primary system has worked this way, and I do think also that money in politics has worked this way, to empower the fringes of both parties, people who are most intensely interested in politics, but who are a distinct minority among American voters and even among the voters of each party. Primary voters are about 8 to 10% of each party's voters. And so they're really a sliver of the American electorate. And the same is true of significant donors at this point. And as you say, their donations are not geographically distributed. They give money to national figures, and sometimes they give money to people who become prominent. Maybe they're in local races, but not in their own locale. And in that sense, the way in which money flows contributes to the enormous nationalization of our politics. And again, it leads us to think that the stakes of national elections, especially presidential elections, to some degree also congressional, are absolute, that the stakes are everything. And therefore, the people who are most intensely engaged tend to have an outsized effect on not only the outcomes, but even the options we have on who can run and who can enter the field. And we're left with a result on the ballot on election day that just doesn't really represent the options people want to have. I think there's a lot of room for thinking about the party system and the election system with that problem in mind.
Yeah, I think one of the more robust findings in the social science on this is that um, folks that donate at any level in the political system tend to be at the ideological extreme compared to the
Yeah.
average voter.
And
Uh,
it's worth seeing what that means, by the way, Brian. People who we describe as being at the ideological extremes are people who are least interested in seeing bargaining and accommodation in the political system because they're purists, right? And it's okay, they're allowed to be. But the fact is, they're a small portion of the electorate, and most voters would much rather see a system in which there is much more bargaining across party lines, deal making to arrive at policy solutions, and those views are vastly underrepresented, again, because of the primary system to a large extent, and I think also to some degree because of the way money works. What you end up with is a system that overrepresents the views of people who don't want the system to work, right? If as we say, the working of the system involves bargaining and accommodation, involves compelling different factions to deal with each other, empowering voters who don't want that to happen is ultimately empowering voters who don't want the system to work. Maybe they want a different system, but that's not what they're doing. They're not creating a different system. They're just not allowing the one we have to work. And I think we have to think about how to change the incentives that confront political actors so that they understand their role as defined by our constitutional system, and therefore understand their role as involving negotiation, bargaining, and accommodation.
Now, on that negotiation, bargaining, and accommodation, obviously the first article in the Constitution is Article 1 devoted to Congress. You have a whole chapter on Congress, and I think one of the biggest takeaways from your book is that Congress is not functioning properly. And because it is not capable of carrying out its constitutional role, you're also seeing the other branches, the executive and the judiciary, do things that are really not in their lane to kind of pick up the slack, so to speak. So could you just say a little bit, especially for those that haven't read the book yet, could you talk a little bit about the benefits that we would experience if we could promote a better functioning Congress?
Congress really is the preeminent institution of our national government. It's Article 1, not by coincidence. And part of the reason for that is that Congress is the place where it's actually possible to act together when you don't think alike. It is a plural institution. It's representative to some degree of the diversity of our society. And therefore, it makes it possible for negotiation to happen among the different factions of American political life. The presidency is one person, right? Plenty of people work for the president, but the president is a single individual, and so cannot, in his own person, in fact, represent the diversity of American life. And the presidency is not thought of as a representative institution in the Constitution. It's an elected office for the sake of accountability, but it is an administrative institution. Congress is meant to be representative, and therefore, in a Republican system, in a democracy, that means that it is meant to be the most powerful of our institutions and the driver of the system, the institution that really sets the direction and the tone of our politics. And the way Congress works, and in this sense, it is distinct from some of the parliamentary systems that you find in many other democracies. Congress is fundamentally built for negotiation, for bargaining and accommodation. It's built to work slowly. It's built to make it difficult for narrow majorities to get their way. Right? In a parliamentary system, if you have a majority, you can do everything. You control the entire government. In the American system, if your majority is not very large, you can't really do very much because there are two houses of Congress, because there are some supermajority requirements. There's another branch that's also elected. There are courts that are independent. It's all meant to compel accommodation and bargaining, to slow down narrow majorities and force them to grow before they can act. And the essential institution for that purpose is Congress, so that a system with a functional Congress at its center would be a system with a lot of bargaining and accommodation at its center. A system with a dysfunctional Congress at its center would lose the knack for coalition building. And that's exactly what we've seen. We are living in a time when I think the foremost constitutional problem is the willful weakness of the Congress. Members don't want the responsibility to lead. They don't want to make the hard decisions. They want the president to do that. And then they want to stand on the side and comment, either in favor or against. They want to do oversight, but they don't themselves want to take on the hard choices. And the problem that creates is enormous. You know, I'm a conservative and I complain a lot about the excessive power of the presidency and the regulatory state. I complain about courts overreaching. All of that happens because Congress underreaches. It's hard to blame those other institutions for filling a vacuum. The problem is the vacuum, and the vacuum is created by Congress because members don't perceive the strength of the institution to be the source of their own strength. They think in terms of the strength of their party. They think in terms of the centrality of the president. And they need to be reminded that ultimately their success should be measured by the strength of their institution and the functioning of Congress itself. They need to reinvest themselves in legislative work. And so in thinking about Congress, I think about some reforms of the institution that might reinvest members in legislative work rather than in performative politics, which is how a lot of them now understand success. They understand success by how many followers you have on social media, by how prominent you are in the theater of our national politics, rather than by what role you play in advancing legislation. And the result of that is that we don't see a lot of legislation advanced, and we don't see a lot of the kind of governance that our system is built to facilitate.
You know, you used a key word when you were talking about Congress's function, which is the representative function. I mean, that was Madison thought that Congress and the elected branches in general, that scheme of representation was so crucial. And at American Promise, one of the core sort of organizing principles behind what we're doing is this idea of power ultimately being rooted in the people. And I know you say that in your book, and we call it popular sovereignty. I was just hoping you could say a little bit from your perspective as a conservative. What do you think about the concept of popular sovereignty and how it may relate to what I think is fair to say populist energy on kind of both sides of the spectrum that we're seeing lately in politics in the US?
Well, I think popular sovereignty is ultimately the essential source of legitimacy in a democratic government. It's what makes it legitimate for government to act. Now, the Constitution is certainly built on the sense that that is the only source of legitimacy. It's also, though, built on the sense that majorities can be dangerous too, that there are ways in which majorities can endanger the rights of minorities and the rights of individuals. And so the Constitution strives for a kind of balance between majority rule and minority rights. And if you remember that it also strives to let us act together when we don't think alike, you start to see why we have such a complex system. It is intended to drive us into bargaining and negotiation, and yet it also draws all of its legitimacy from popular sovereignty, which ultimately means majority rule. There's really no other way for popular sovereignty to translate into political action. Any alternative to it is minority rule, which is not a legitimate democratic mode of governance. And so the Constitution, rather than than veer toward minority rule forces majorities to grow before they can have significant power and requires them to slow down and build coalitions in order to use power. I think that's a brilliant way to think about how to balance majority rule and minority rights, how to make sure that majorities can't just trample minorities, which does happen in populist moments. That is always a danger. Um, that majorities will organize themselves around hostility and opposition to the rights of minorities. Obviously, we've seen that in American life. And the Constitution is built to restrain that while still rooting its legitimacy in majority rule. I think this is why working constitutionally, as you yourself have mentioned, is a way to combine popular sovereignty with genuine political legitimacy rooted in a commitment to the rights of all Americans. It's a matter of working through the system rather than against the system. I think there is always a danger in populist times, whether it's populism of the left or of the right, that the energy of popular sovereignty will be turned against the Constitution rather than in defense of it. We run that danger now. There's no question about it. You see it sometimes from the left in attacks on the independence of the judiciary. You see it sometimes from the right in attacks on the constraints on our majoritarian institutions. And so I think it is worth paying attention to the way in which the Constitution tries to find this balance. But at the end of the day, there is no other source of legitimacy in a free society than majority rule, which expresses popular sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, even the elements of the Constitution that function to protect, for example, uh, minorities who may not have political power otherwise by protecting individual rights or equal protection, those were added to the Constitution through a supermajoritarian process. So at some
Right.
point, it was the people who said, we believe this needs to be protected. Could we talk about the courts for a minute? So, uh, in your chapter on the courts, you talk about an approach to constitutional interpretation, which I think a lot of folks will have heard about. It's called originalism, and you write that really originalism was intended to kind of champion an ideal of self-government rooted in this premise that legitimate public power is a function of popular sovereignty. And so instead of judges or the courts making policy, they should really stick to the original public meaning of the text as a way to connect up with whatever the people had decided. Now, I think there have been times in our history when clearly the judiciary has overstepped its bounds and exercised power in a way that probably should have been more properly exercised by a legislature or another representative institution. So obviously at American Promise, we believe that the entire area of campaign finance is sort of an example of that judicial overreach. And a goal of the amendment is to take those decisions out of the courts largely and put them back in the states and Congress. I was wondering if you could just share some thoughts on how, when the judiciary overreaches, it can undermine that unifying purpose that you've mentioned previously about the Constitution.
Yeah, look, I think originalism really just means that the role of judges is constrained to interpreting the meaning of the law, so that the disputes that courts resolve, and that's what courts do, they resolve disputes. The disputes are about what the law is rather than what it should be. Otherwise, we take questions that can only be legitimately resolved in our elected institutions and address them in essentially arbitrary ways. I mean, the Supreme Court is just 9 people in a society of 330 million people. And so to empower judges to make decisions about the proper direction of American public policy, rather than to make decisions about what the law as written and enacted means, is to enable those 9 people to govern us without our consent. And that kind of arbitrary rule, I think, is actually the every alternative to originalism looks like that. If it's not originalism, then it is arbitrary rule by 9 people. And so I think the case for originalism is not that the Constitution is perfect or that the framers somehow knew everything, but that the Constitution was enacted through votes of supermajorities. The Constitution allows us a process by which we make policy decisions through votes of majorities. And every other way for judges to operate is essentially arbitrary and illegitimate. So, to my mind, the case for originalism is just a matter of what the role of the judge is actually intended to be. Um, there certainly are some instances where I have disagreed with the court's interpretation of the Constitution. And even in those instances, I think there's a case to be made. The judges can make a claim on can make a claim to the legitimacy of their work if they ground their decision in an argument about the meaning of the Constitution and the law, rather than in an argument about the proper direction of public policy, as courts too often have done. I think the approach of addressing what you take to be a misguided judicial decision through constitutional amendment is the right approach. That is to say, that ultimately there can't be any question that the public has the power to override judicial decisions through constitutional amendment. Constitutional decisions, like the decisions about campaign finance that are rooted in the First Amendment, can really only be overruled by a constitutional change or a new court majority deciding things in a different way. And so I think that whether or not you take the decisions surrounding campaign finance to have been judicial overreach or a problem with the Constitution, the solution is going to be the same. The solution is a constitutional amendment. I think that the substance of those decisions is complex and difficult, and the subject is also a function of an approach to campaign finance reform that I think was misguided to begin with. I think at the center of campaign finance reform should be the necessity for transparency and the character of the American party system. I think by closing off paths to funding in various ways, measures like McCain-Feingold moved money into dark corners of our political life where there's much less accountability for how money is raised and spent than there was before, and ultimately did enormous harm in the process of trying to do some good. But the question of what our campaign finance system should look like is a political question. It needs to be decided by the public through its representatives. And so I do think that the approach you're taking here is ultimately the way to address what you take to be a mistaken decision of the Supreme Court. There's no other way that's available to us. I think the court, for the sake of its own legitimacy, has to ground its decisions in the language of the laws and the Constitution. And to the extent that it does that, it also leaves us paths open to changing the laws and the Constitution. And obviously, it's no easy thing to change the Constitution. But if we believe that that's what's necessary for the health of our political system, then obviously that's a path available to American citizens.
Um, are you familiar at all with the work of Judge Jeffrey Sutton out of the Sixth Circuit? So I'm just reminded of in his most recent book, he talked about how one of the problems when the court decides to take an area of policy and put it under a certain category, let's say the First Amendment or some other amendment, and basically constitutionalize the whole area, it means, okay, now the court's open for business to have all these arguments, but the other, like the representative branches, are now closed for business. And I was just wondering if that kind of resonates.
Absolutely. And it also it creates a kind of escape valve for elected officials to just say, well, the courts will handle it. I think we actually saw this in campaign finance in the early 2000s, when President George W. Bush, who I worked for and I admire, signed the campaign finance law of that period, the McCain-Feingold bill. He actually said that he thought part of it was unconstitutional. And in the signing statement, he said the courts will figure this out. He signed it thinking it was unconstitutional. That's the kind of thing that happens when the courts constitutionalize these questions, is the other decision makers in our system, the elected officials, just say, well, this isn't my job. This is somebody else's job. This is the judge's job. And I think it's a very dangerous path to take for American democracy, because ultimately the core decisions we have to make are decisions we have to assign to our elected officials. And the roles of judges is to apply the frameworks those elected officials create to particular situations. It's not to rewrite them, it's not to reinvent them, it's not to create them out of whole cloth. And when we forget the constraints of the judge's role, we end up creating constraints on American democracy, which are not intended to be there and which are not good for our system.
Um, One of the things that you call for a few times in the book is this idea of constitutional restoration and repair. And I think you've already identified that the amendment process itself can be a mechanism for that restoration and repair. I mean, that's certainly what we think we're doing at American Promise, trying to make sure popular sovereignty remains intact as the fundamental source of power. So, for those of us who are engaged in what we believe is constitutional restoration and repair, do you have some general advice you want to share?
Well, look, I think it's important to see ourselves always as acting in an effort to strengthen the system and allow it to work better, and not to put ourselves in opposition to the American constitutional system per se. The system does not point right or left. The system allows us to have a politics in which we can make significant policy choices as a society. And so it's the infrastructure of American political life. And we should all see that healthy infrastructure is essential for any function we want to perform. And so I do think it's important for people who want reform to understand ourselves as being in the business of repair and renewal, and not in the business of revolution and transformation that's fundamental. The American Constitution is much more of a solution than a problem in a moment like this. And we have to allow it to enable it to be an effective solution for us by working with it where we can rather than against it. Sometimes that does mean amendments, and sometimes it just means a reformation of constitutional practice. It means reminding everyone in the system, public officials, but also citizens, of what our roles actually are in the constitutional system. Because a lot of what's broken down, as we've been discussing, is members of Congress not doing their job and not even recognizing what the job is, and judges not doing their job, but doing a different job, playing a different part than is intended for them. You know, if you go to Mount Vernon, you can see George Washington's copy of the Constitution. And on the margins, next to several sections, he writes the word president next to things that are the president's job. They describe what he's supposed to do. I think every constitutional officer, and frankly, a lot of citizens, should go through that document and think about what's my role? What's the job that's required of me in this situation? And a lot of constitutional renewal and repair is a function of becoming reacquainted with what the system expects of us and demands of us. And that can also help us to clarify where there might be changes needed in the way it works, so that we can create a set of offices, a set of expectations, and an idea of citizenship that can serve Americans well. Our Constitution has done that over time, and the fact that it can change has done that for us over time. And ultimately, I think that's why a spirit of repair, rather than a spirit of hostility to the Constitution, is the way to take on our frustrations and address the problems we see.
Absolutely. I want to work in a question from one of our stellar volunteers, Laura Nittmeyer. She sort of notes that it seems that a majority of Americans have actually left the political parties. And so, at least at the primary level, there's a minority of folks that are choosing the candidates. I don't know all the empirical data around that, but this idea that the choosing sort of is happening at the extremes because a lot of folks are either independent or have checked out. And she's wondering, do you have any thoughts about what can be done to tweak the incentives there?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the book on the American party system, and I think that there is a way in which the party system is broken because we've lost sight of how it is supposed to engage with the larger American constitutional system. The purpose of the system is to facilitate coalition building, and the parties, you would think, would be natural partners in that effort, especially in a two-party system where each party is likely to be a broad coalition. Our two-party system is very deeply rooted in the structure of the American constitutional system. We've almost always had essentially two large parties. That's a function of all kinds of things about our system, but maybe especially of the system of presidential selection. The design of the Electoral College is that you need an absolute majority of electors to win the presidency, which means that if there are more than two serious candidates for president, the election is likely to go to the House. And that happened twice in the 19th century, created enormous crises of legitimacy. And in the wake of the second one, 1824, really a two-party system emerged that has been more or less durable since then. And I think on the whole, that system can serve us well. But it's vital to see that at the center of what the parties do is candidate selection, is populating the system with office seekers and therefore office holders. The two parties in the last 50 years or so have given up that work of candidate selection, have turned it over to what are really almost random electorates on primary day. If 8% of the public is turning up, then what you're getting is not a representative idea of what American voters want. And you're also not getting the parties as institutions working to facilitate candidate selection. Instead, you're getting the people who are most intensely interested in politics. And look, it's good to be interested in politics. I'm interested in politics. I vote in primaries. But people who are most intensely interested in politics also often are the craziest people in our country. And we begin every election cycle by basically asking the people who least want the system to work, who do you want in the political system? And the answer is people who don't want to compromise, people who don't want to bargain, people who want to be ideological purists and who view the other party as the country's biggest problem. And I think at this point, both parties approach the public too often with the argument that the biggest problem we face is the other party. And the most important thing we can do is keep them from winning. That's essentially implicitly the argument that both parties make to voters now. I think the structure of the primary system has a lot to do with that. It's not obvious how to fix that. We are not going back to a pre-primary system where party bosses choose candidates. I don't want to go back to that, and we're not going to. The
Yeah.
question is, how do you move forward in a way that allows a broader slice of the American electorate to be represented? I talk in the book about ranked choice in primaries as a way of doing that. There are other ways to experiment with it. One of the beauties of federalism is that the party system is very state-based. You can try different things in different states and see what works. And I think this is a time for that kind of experimentation.
Yeah, that's the promise of federalism, right? If it could be opened up for states to try different things, you might realize that something works better than the status quo. And I think that's probably also true with the way we fund our elections. I think I shared with you when we met in DC that our strategy when it comes to a constitutional amendment is proposal by Congress and then ratification by three-quarters of the state. We have a question in here in the chat from Dave Black about another way of proposing amendments, which is an Article 5 convention to propose amendments. And I was just wondering, are you familiar with calls for an Article 5 convention? And do you have any thoughts specifically, people who have supported a convention often point to Congress's dysfunction as the reason why a convention would be necessary. So I didn't know if you wanted to respond to Dave's question.
Well, it's hard to see how what a convention would come up with that would in fact address Congress's dysfunction. And my worry about a convention is that it's a very, very open forum for vast transformations of the Constitution. It's very hard to know in advance what a convention would arrive at. Its decisions would be made by majority vote, by simple majorities. And I think it would be a tremendously risky and dangerous way to open up the Constitution to all kinds of changes. Look, there are counter-majoritarian elements of our constitutional system, which are very important, and we should all be glad they're there because we all find ourselves in the minority now and then. I think if you put the First Amendment up for a vote now, I'm not persuaded that religious freedom would get a majority behind it, for example. If you put up some really critical, crucial elements of our constitutional system, simple majorities might vote against them because a lot of them are intended to frustrate narrow majorities and force them to grow. So I am very concerned about what we would end up with from an open-ended Article 5 convention. I think more narrowly tailored amendments that build public support over time and demonstrate by passing Congress and then getting a supermajority of the states, demonstrate broad public support over an extended period, a period of several years. It would certainly take years to get an amendment through, is a much better way of showing that there is a concerted public will for changing the Constitution in some particular way, rather than creating a moment where narrow majorities that are much more ephemeral could exercise tremendous transformative change of the Constitution. So I'm not a fan of the Article 5 approach. I'm much more a fan of the individual amendment approach.
Well, as we wrap up, I have two last questions for you. One was from our friend Leo Sprecher, which is he's going back to this idea that Congress needs to see itself more in its representative role, but he wonders if that is really possible when the lifeblood for a lot of members of Congress, if they have no choice but to have to rely on massive amounts of money, either directly to their campaign or outside super PACs from large moneyed interests. And do you think that that can interfere with their representative role?
Absolutely. I think that there is a role for campaign finance rules to allow members to be more focused on their legislative work. In my view, a lot of that should be a matter of money flowing through the parties rather than around the parties. I think that's one way to transform the system that might even meet the court's existing constraints, but whether it does or not would be a better way to think about what the campaign finance system should look like. But there's no question that a lot of members of Congress now have to spend an enormous amount of their time raising money for their own campaigns. And also that the way in which you advance in Congress is by proving to your colleagues that you can raise money for their campaigns,
Yeah.
rather than by showing that you would be an excellent chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. You get to be chairman by showing that you can create a PAC that will fund everybody else's reelection. That's not the right way to think about what a legislator ought to be. And there's no question that it's a part of the problem we see.
All right. My last question actually picks up on the very first line of your book, where you say, "This is a book about America, and therefore it is a hopeful book." So, as we're all heading into the new year, looking for reasons to be hopeful, I'm wondering what's giving you hope for 2025?
You know, that line is made to make you wonder, because this isn't a time when hope is the natural response to a lot of what's going on in our politics. And yet, I absolutely am hopeful about America. I think it's important to see what hope is and what it isn't. I'm not an optimist. I'm a conservative, so I'm certainly not an optimist. But I'm not a pessimist either. I think those are both ways of approaching the future passively, of saying either everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it, or we're doomed, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, there is. There's a lot we can do. And to be hopeful is to believe that things could turn out well if we are willing to take the initiative and act and work to make them so. And when you see it that way, it seems to me that looking at America should give us a lot of hope. This is a tremendously dynamic society. It's a country full of people who are not willing to just live with misery in their own lives and in their neighbors' lives. They want to do something about it. And I do think it's up to people who think about the structure of our political system to help Americans see what they could do about it. But what gives me hope is that we get to be Americans together. We get to live in this society. It has never made sense, not since 1776, to bet against America. And it does not make sense now. There's no society with a greater claim to make on the future than the United States of America. I think we face a choice between realizing that opportunity and failing to, and that choice does require us to act as citizens. But the fact that we have the opportunity we have is absolutely a source of hope. And just, the fact that I get to be an American gives me hope. What can I say?
That's fantastic. Great way to end. And thank you, Dr. Yuval Levin, for sharing your time, your wisdom with us. And also, of course, thank you to everybody out there who tuned in.
Thank you very much.
Have a great holiday and a wonderful new year.